So good evening, everybody, and you're very welcome to this webinar series from Knock Shrine. My name is Eamon Conway. I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Tuam, but on ministry at Mary Immaculate College in Limerick. And I was very delighted to be invited by Father Richard Gibbons and the team at Knock Shrine to lead these series of talks, conversations, which we're going to have together over the next few weeks during Lent. Now, while we're doing them during Lent, I sincerely hope that you won't be doing them for your penance. I hope that they will be enjoyable and enriching. They're really conversations with people who I have got to know over the last number of years, who are companions along the journey of faith, really, in many different ways. And tonight, I have the great pleasure of beginning the series with Patrick and Linda. Patrick, Tracy, and Linda Rainsberry have become very, very close friends indeed. Indeed, their whole family have become a place of great welcome and refuge for me at different times over the past 12 years since we've actually got to know each other. So I'm going to invite Patrick and Linda now to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit about their family, a little bit about their ministry at their home, where they have a very special centre of welcome for family prayer for the domestic church called Integritas. And we're going to speak for the next 20 minutes or so about the importance and value of the family as a place of faith. Patrick and Linda, you're very welcome to our webinar series this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Evan. So we are both delighted with the invitation and are delighted to be able to speak this evening. So I'm Linda Rainsberry. I grew up in Tullamore, County Offaly. I'm actually a member of the Church of Ireland. And in 1995, I moved to Kilkenny, where I met this dashing man beside me here, Patrick Tracy. Sure. And following on that, we got married and we have 4 children. So originally I was working as a solicitor, but when our children came along, I became a full-time mom. So that has occupied me since.
And one of the things about our home outside Kilkenny is that we don't have proper broadband. And because of that, we're actually here in my office in Dublin, which is where I work. So this isn't actually our home, unfortunately. And so we got married and we have 4 children who are, with a daughter who is 21. And then we have 3 sons who are 19, 18 and 15. And when we moved into our house in 21 years ago, we had a prayer room built at the basement of the house. And then we started inviting people to come for prayer. And then we started developing a program of courses to help people with prayer and theological reflection. And out of that then developed a kind of an understanding of the need to develop a domestic model of church, or to, I suppose, reinvigorate a sense of how important the family home is as the key institution in the future of the church. And then over time we've developed then conferences and reflecting on issues of public importance, such in particular as the nature of marriage, the importance of family, and the importance of building a society which places the family at the centre of it.
St. John Paul II used that very memorable phrase, which Pope Francis, of course, has also echoed so many times, that the future of humanity passes by way of the family. Can you tell us a little bit about how you have really striven to hand on the faith in your own family, and why you see the family as so important in the handing on of faith?
Well, I suppose handing on the faith is a $60 million question to answer. How do you achieve that? And Patrick and I are both committed to our faith, but yet we meet the same resistance and questioning from our teenage children as every other family do. I think what helps me to remember is a saying that a great friend of ours, Father Des O'Donnell, an Obleg father in Dublin who visited us a number of times, he used to always say, do you know, when it comes to issues of handing on the faith, let God get the ulcer. So that really, faith isn't information. It's not just something that you can give to somebody. So to an extent, faith is a matter between each person and God. So it's not really between the parent and the child, it's between the child and God. And so the parent's role I see as facilitating the child to learn about the background to Christian faith. So to know the story and then to know some of the basic teachings of the church. And the story is easily taught as young kids at bedtime. They're just as happy to listen to stories of some of the parables or the miracles of Jesus or Noah's Ark or the creation stories make just as good a bedtime story as any fairy stories or a Hansel and Gretel or anything like that. So it's quite easy to engage children in the texts of the story when they're young, and then they're familiar with it. It's important to develop a church habit so that they're brought to church regularly as children, and they're familiar with liturgy and understand it, and that they have a basic understanding of what the church teaches in terms of faith and doctrine. And then whether faith takes root or flourishes in their lives really is something that is beyond our control, and we just need to trust and know that we've done what we can. And also, obviously, by our own model and example and how we live, if that's attractive to children, then they will hopefully follow the example of parents in pursuing faith in their lives or questioning it. But I think that just being able to get your child to come to church with you as a teenager, it doesn't necessarily prove that they are people of faith or that they are convinced of faith. They may be just going to please you. So a kid who lies in bed on a Sunday morning might actually be further along in their journey of faith than a kid who will, regularly come to mass with you. So it's something that we can never really be sure of. And I suppose in a way, we need to hand that over to God and be trusting that the relationship isn't ours to control.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I agree with all of that, and I better, or I'll be in trouble on the drive home tonight. But I think there's a particular issue, if I can put it like that, around young people and parenting at the moment. And obviously, this issue relates to social media, and it relates to how much communication is virtual, or another word I'd use for it is almost disembodied. And to my mind, the most important thing, the thing that guarantees happiness, I feel, in children, and is the whole bedrock of faith, is ensuring as best as you can that they cultivate good friendships. And I mean real friendships. Now, it's a difficult struggle for parents as to where, smartphones and social media fit into this, because if you deprive a child of the method of social media, you can block them developing friends. On the other hand, if the child has an unhealthy reliance on social media, they lose the capacity to learn how to truly relate. So there's no fixed answer to this. But what there is a fixed answer to is how important it is to allow your children and to enable your children to get a sense of real friendship and being loved by their friends. And you see, there's a curious balance here, which Linda kind of struck a chord with me when she said this, that on the one hand, we have to surrender because it's God's grace. I mean, faith is ultimately a gift in action of God's grace in one's life. But on the other hand, because the society is so secularized at the moment and so disembodied and so caught up with technology, or what Pope Francis calls the technocratic paradigm, or the way in which everything is seen through technology, as a parent, you've got to be very intentional about passing on the faith. In other words, and I mean, that's a kind of a cliche, I suppose, passing on the faith, but it's got to become a conscious priority in your life that I want my children to really have good friends and good friendships. And I want them to know the story of the Father and Jesus and the Holy Spirit. I want them to know this. And it seems to me that the number one way, there's nothing new about any of this, the number one way in which children get a sense of the knowledge of faith is they pick it up from their parents. One thing I'm very struck about with young people at the moment too is that it's what's called the age of authenticity. Young people want adults to be authentic. And if a parent wants to pass on the faith to their child, they've got to live the faith themselves, not talk about it. They've got to live it. In other words, the child has got to see it in the action and the belief and the conversation. And one thing that makes me very happy about our own children, and there's nothing, I might add, there's nothing remotely pious about our own children. But what I do love is that I do feel that they've picked up an awful lot from conversations in our house, from people who call to our house, from our own friends who they hear dialogue, they hear conversations, very informal conversations, but they hear them. And the reason why I think this is so important, and this goes back really to something in the Old Testament, is that it really comes down to remembering God, remembering God's presence, remembering the story, learning the story, but remembering the story. And this is why I think the COVID-19 experience is so important, because the COVID-19 experience forces us to come back to our families, come back to our family home, come back to our familial relationships. And the home needs to become a place of sanctuary. And what I mean by that is a place where God is remembered or re-embodied through iconography, our images, our books, but in particular through friendships and through conversations.
I'm just in my own mind as I'm listening to you, and I mean I know this because I've been with you and I've shared your wonderful table fellowship over the years, and I can picture and imagine very much in a sense how that's so possible even when you don't have visitors, but among yourselves as a family. But then the images we've had on the TV, particularly over the last weeks and months, of families almost in crisis because of the pressures they're under now, the homeschooling. Parents trying to work from home at the same time, almost of a kind of a chaotic family situation for so many. All this talk that there is at the moment too, and completely accepted of young people and indeed their parents feeling challenged in terms of their own mental health. I mean, how, if you would say, from your own experience, even a first step towards a calmer, kind of less fluid, less hectic, less sense of almost panic that we seem to see from so many of these images. What would your suggestion be, just from your own experience? And I realize entirely you're not coming from some different planet. You're coming from the realities of trying to look after your own children at home, who are all obviously working from home at the moment as well. How could you speak into that kind of a situation?
I always have a strong sense when I speak of God or my belief in God and faith. I think not only of the New Testament story and how we are God's children through Christ, but of the Old Testament story and how God as our creator is, that we are creatures of God and made in his being. And in the story of Moses and the burning bush, when the Lord speaks to Moses from the bush, and Moses says to the Lord, like, who is sending me to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? And God answers in those famous lines, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. That even in this mysterious name that isn't really a name, God is telling us, come into the present, come into the now. I am who I am, not I was who I was. And I think really within the COVID-19 situation, and we're fortunate because we live out in the country and we have a big garden and we have plenty of space so that we don't have to, we're not all piled on top of each other, and we do have an opportunity to be out in lovely open air. But nonetheless, there are pressures with all of us, sharing the same space, and it's much busier, more demanding to keep a house going when it's full of teenagers than when they might normally be dispersed around the place. But I think just being very present brings a calm to any situation. That if you just remember that God holds us in being, that the story of creation is a continuing one. It's not one that happened right back at the Big Bang. What the story of creation teaches us is that God creates in the present tense. God holds us in being at every second. And so we are held, we are secure, and we are loved. And if we can have even the vaguest sense of that in the midst of a chaotic kitchen where you have, kids looking for food and someone else looking for homework and someone else looking for something else, that we are all held in this exact moment, right this very minute, in God's love. And if you can draw yourself back into that, to just take a breath and then to share that sense of being held and being loved in every single second, not only at Mass on Sundays, but in the middle of a busy, hectic, upside down kitchen. God is every bit as present there, and holding us and giving us each breath one after another at every second. Mm. That is a sense I really carry with me, that actually changes the perspective of how I see stressful or anxious situations, because no matter how stressed or anxious I feel, beneath the stress and the anxiety is a sure foundation, is a sense of being held and loved in God's care at every second.
In his exhortation on holiness, Pope Francis, talked about a woman who comes to him and says, Father, he was a priest at the time, I don't have time to pray. I'm too busy. I'm looking after my family. I have my mother-in-law that I have to take care of all these young children. So I don't have time to pray. I wish I had. And he says, that's where you're encountering God, in those different gestures of prayer. And I must say, during this lockdown, as Patrick and Linda will know, but my dad lives with me. He's at a very advanced age now. He's 94, and he needs a lot of care. And there have been times when I would have, I have to just make a mental adjustment, say, this is where I am meant to be at the moment. I've lots of books to read, I've lots of essays to correct, but this is where God wants me to be at this moment. It's about finding God, or rather letting God find us in the moments in which we are, not maybe the one we'd like to be in, but the one in which we are, and that's where God is met and encountered and reverenced, in a sense, by that reverence of care, in your case, for your children and your family. Patrick, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, just taking up from what Linda said, or what you said, I think what the COVID-19 experience forces us to face, and it's a very good thing we're forced to face, is that what really matters in life is relationships and the quality of the relationships in your life. And what it comes down to ultimately, what the spiritual life really comes down to, is making the time and space for relationships. Now, what I mean by that is, two things. Making the time and space for the relationship with God, and making the time and space for the relationship with family and with friends and with people who who you have a sense of compassion for. And that can be a complete stranger as well, incidentally. But what's very important, I think, is that you've got to be intentional about it. In other words, if you want to lose weight and become fit, you've got to become committed to taking exercise. And it's no different with relationships in your life. You've got to consciously make the time and the space for a way of prayer. And when I use the word prayer, I don't mean prayer in simply the conventional way we understand it. I mean communication with God. That can be through reading. It can be through listening to music, which is a particular uplifting sense. But there's got to be a sense of interiority from it. And then allied to that, then you've got to be intentional about relating to the people who mean something to you. As you were talking about your dad, or obviously how I feel about Linda or our kids. But what I do notice with my wife sitting beside me here is that she's the extrovert. It mightn't appear that way in our relationship, but she's the extrovert. And I know Linda really loves being with her friends. And in COVID, you've got to. It's a struggle because there's so many limitations put. And what's interesting is there's limitations put on the physical meeting of friends. See, it's very interesting because the whole COVID-19 reality brings us in touch with something we'd forgotten about. It's the physical presence. Even not being able to go to mass, not being able to pray with other people, not being able to have a pint with somebody in a bar is a huge loss. You don't realize that, but the physical presence is extremely important. And really, why this is so important for Christians, for us as Christians, is that we believe in an incarnational reality. From the Eucharist and from God becoming fully incarnate in a man, and from each one of us being made in the image and likeness of God, we believe that God's love and the Holy Spirit penetrates into the world, into friendships, into relationships, into the family. And that's physically physical, it's deeply embodied in reality, unfortunately. On one level, it gets us in touch with our families, but on another level, unfortunately, it pushes us more into this technocratic reality. So even this conversation we're having tonight has a certain artificial sense because of the technological nature of it, But I hope when this COVID-19 pandemic passes that, we'll really have a new sense of how important our friends are to us and how important and most importantly, joyful it is to have physical contact with each other.
I'm picking up from a lot of priest friends who in parishes, and indeed a lot of sociological commentators as well. They're saying that when this passes, people have got out of the habit of going to mass or going to their religious services. And I've heard people say to me, "Oh, sure, I've got used to watching mass on TV now. You can make a cup of tea and you can get the lunch ready, and you can be watching away there. The TV's on in the corner." Do you think that's going to happen, Patrick and Linda? Do you think people will simply fall out of the habit now of going to church? And if they do, what's that saying to what that experience has been for people?
Who knows? but my own feeling for myself is I can't wait to get back to our parish being active and being together. I belong to a lovely Church of Ireland community at Ennisnag, and there's a wonderful group of people who I really miss. And we would meet up on Sundays, and now I don't see them. So, and then obviously going to service and being able to partake in the Eucharist, that's a huge loss for months and months not to be able to receive Eucharist. Like, I feel that like a physical pain. So I think that for a great number of people who are watching services online now, just can't wait to get back to church. And maybe some won't come back, but I believe most will, because it's just completely different. Being there in person, it's just a whole different experience. But I think that, as Patrick was suggesting there, that the hunger we will feel for human contact and for socializing and being together will be, the need for that, the heightened sense of that will continue for quite a while after this lockdown is finished, because we've been sort of in lockdown for the best part of a year. It looks like it's going to go on for most of this year. So yeah, we feel starved already. I think there'll be a huge hunger for people to get back into churches and to meet each other again and to be able to share in the Eucharist together.
Yeah, just taking up from that too, just before we talk about going back to churches, I think like living in the now, in the middle of this, it's extremely important to realize how important your own home is as a sanctuary and a place of Christian experience and Christian remembrance. So you see, I think what's very important is it's so important as Christians that we stay in touch with joy and consolation, and that we don't allow ourselves to become overawed by desolation and negativity and fear. And what we need to do at this time is we need to see this as a time for spiritual renewal of the home as a place of remembrance and encounter with God's love and God's presence. Now, having said that, I also think what we also need to remember is that Ireland is a particularly difficult country at this particular time in Western history to live out the Christian experience. I mean, I would struggle to think of any other country in the West at the moment where it is so difficult to actually live out and speak about Christian faith. And one of the reasons for that is, and you touched on this earlier, is that for very good reason, so many wonderful priests that we have are demoralized, and that's a huge part, I think, as well, of the role of family. I mean, we have been tremendously lucky in our family that throughout our marriage, we've always had priests who are really, really close friends of ours, which is an amazing gift, because then you can have mass in your home and it affects your children get a direct encounter with faith too. So I think we need to realize that at this particular time in Ireland, really over the last 15 to 20 years, and perhaps for another 15 to 20 years, in other words, perhaps for the remainder of the adult life of the three of us, it just so happens it's particularly hard in this country to live out a Christian Catholic experience. And it's important to acknowledge that. It's a winter in that sense. But having said all of that, it's also at the very root of the Christian experience of the calling to live a life of virtue, that virtue thrives when being tested. And again, I'm sorry for being repetitive about this, but it again comes back to the importance of friendship, because good friends who also want and are seeking and are working on a genuine Christian experience, the amount of consolation and sustenance you get from those friendships can never be underestimated.
Okay, one of the things we really need to talk about, because I think it'll be so enriching for people, is just to hear you talk about marriage and the gift of marriage and the sacrament of marriage and what that means to you. If you share a little bit with people about that. I think, for example, a lot of young people listening perhaps or watching us this evening might struggle with the idea of the commitment that marriage entails. So would you say a little bit about what marriage means for both of you?
It's your turn.
Where do we begin? I remember shortly after getting married, that when we got married, most of our friends were getting married around the same time. But I had a very real sense that Patrick was the man I wanted to marry. But nonetheless, I was quite surprised by the depth of feeling or the change in feeling I felt having gone through our ceremony of marriage, or the sacrament of marriage, that it is actually, it's more than you expect it to be somehow, and that the commitment became very real, very definite, very deepened, just by virtue of celebrating the sacrament of marriage. And we had Eucharist, and it was a wonderful day. And then very quickly we were blessed with children. But we're married now for 22 years. So I'm just beginning to get to know Patrick, I would think. It really is a lifelong thing to get to know your partner, and it's a wonderful thing when they keep surprising you in wonderful ways, but that is actually the truth of it. And the most interesting person I know to talk to in the whole world happens to be my husband. So, we have wonderful conversations all the time, and it's a huge enriching of my life of faith that my husband is also a person of faith. I think that in choosing a person to become married to, that you really do need to consider that question of, well, if I'm a person of faith, is that something that interests my partner? Is it something they're committed to, or is it something they're either opposed to? That isn't something you should just brush aside. That is something you should really look at, because if you're lucky enough to have a marriage where both partners are committed in their faith, that's enormously enriching, so that you can relate not only, psychologically, emotionally, but spiritually as well. That's an enormous part of it, I think.
Mm. Oh, this is doing wonders for me listening to this. We must do this more often, It's very good for our marriage, actually, to hear this. There's two things, I suppose, just listening to Linda, that strike me, and the way you introduced that, Eamon. I just want to respond to the way you introduced it. The first thing is this. I mean, as a young person reflecting on marriage or preparing for marriage, it's normal to be scared. I mean, if you understand the gravity, or you have an intimation of the gravity that's involved, it's completely normal to be scared. I mean, there's nothing worse than being at a marriage where the couple are frivolous, are superficial about what they're actually doing, or jocular about it. Like, it's a serious commitment. Really, it's the most serious commitment, obviously, that a person can make. And again, I'm sorry for repeating this, but I think it's worth saying. It's very important, I think, in our culture, and in particular in the Irish culture at the moment, to understand how difficult it is to make a clear decision about marriage. And the reason for that is that our whole social imagination, our whole conversation about everything at this time in Ireland is about choice. It's all about maximizing choice. So marriage, which stands for a singular, lifelong, permanent commitment to one person, is actually deeply countercultural. And the only reason why it survives is because it touches something at the very root of each of us, the sense of a man and a woman in a faithful marriage for life. It captures something utterly transcendent. And what it captures, and Pope Francis speaks about this very clearly in Amoris Laetitia, is that it gives us an intimation of the very essence of God, of the Trinity. And that, to me, really, as we go on each year in our marriage, what becomes more and more manifest all the time for me is that there are three entities, or three parties in a marriage. In a Christian marriage is a woman and a man rooted in God. And the reason why a Christian marriage where the couples share a faith relationship and a faith commitment, there can be all sorts of struggles, but it's never boring, because there's always an opening out to infinity all the time. So there's always a surprise and a renewal and a sense of purpose. And I did kind of realize this at the time, but I mean, Linda thinks I married her for her looks. She still believes this. And of course, I tell her that every day, but I can go public now and say there was another reason, which was that, like, when I first met Linda, and when we became such good friends, and then we started going out with each other, like, I never met anyone of my own age remotely who I could speak to about matters of faith. And then I could see, like, the Christ identity in her, and she would evoke that identity in me. And that identity, of course, is in all of us. I mean, that's the beauty again of friendship, that real friendship evokes the image and likeness of God in every one of us. So that's really, to my mind, what is critical in marriage, that the couple have a shared sense of a reality beyond time and space, which I call God, and that the love that they have for each other and the love that they have for children that they are gifted with, it's all coming out of that reality of God's presence.
Mm. Many people might think the fact that, remember the Church of Ireland, the Roman Catholic, coming together in marriage would be a challenge, would be an obstacle to be overcome. But I don't think you have experienced it that way.
No, we haven't. No, not at all. Actually, it's been an enormous learning curve. Before we got married, we wondered, and it was painful for us that we had to have the conversation of in which denomination would children be baptized if we had children. So there wasn't any sensible answer to that question. So we just said, well, if we had a daughter, we'd have her baptized in the Church of Ireland, and if we had a son, he'd be baptized in the Roman Catholic Church. And then, as Patrick said to his father when our third son was born, and we had our daughter first, he said, well, Dad, final score is Rome 3, Canterbury 1. But in raising children who are in the Roman Catholic faith, I have come to know, I mean, obviously being married to Patrick, I've come to know it a lot. But like the first time I ever stood in a Roman Catholic church and attended Mass, I was in my 20s. So I had gone through my whole growing years and my college years, not ever having experience. And in fact, I still remember it was in a little church in Michael in County Carlow. And I still remember that service very clearly. And what astonished me was how similar it was, because I presumed it would be totally other, totally different, totally strange, but it actually wasn't. And in fact, the words of the Eucharistic prayer were almost word for word the same. And that struck me so forcibly. I can still remember that 30 years later, the impact of seeing the similarity and closeness. But nonetheless, when our eldest son came to make his first Holy Communion, that was the first time I'd been involved as a family with preparing for First Holy Communion. And it was really wonderful and magical. And growing up at the Church of Ireland, you learned in a different way that you didn't receive Holy Communion until after you were confirmed. So you'd be a teenager. But in the Roman Catholic faith, our son Sam received Eucharist when he was 8, I think. But that was a wonderful, joyful, lovely experience in bringing him through the whole, going to the Mass once a month leading up to his First Holy Communion and preparing him for that. Was a huge learning curve, and I loved it.
See, I think too, I think when we become clear about what is the whole point of Christian faith, what's the whole purpose of the exercise? I mean, why bother? And when you really reflect on that question, I mean, the whole purpose of Christian faith, and Jesus says this so explicitly in John's Gospel, is that I've come so that you may have life and have it to the full. I have come so that you may be joyful and that your joy may be complete. God wants us to be happy. That's the whole purpose of faith, is to have a happy and fulfilled life. And to lead a happy and fulfilled life, the key is to understand your nature as being made in the image and likeness of God, to understand that nature, to listen to that nature, and to serve that nature. In other words, to serve God's love in the world, to impart God's love to other people, and to receive God's love from other people. So once you're clear about this, once you're clear about what the purpose of Christian faith is, the ecumenical question answers itself. It becomes a scandal to start creating division with fellow people who are genuine about their faith, because this is completely contraindicated by the true meaning of Catholicism, the true meaning of Roman Catholicism, and the true meaning of Catholicism, and the true meaning of Anglicanism. So that and this is, I suppose, really, they're kind of interrelated. It seems to me what's interrelated is that we have forgotten two essential things in our experience of Christian faith. And the first is that God wants us to know we're loved. And God wants us to express that love to other people. So Christian faith is an experience of being loved. That's what it's all about, the experience of being loved and being that love to other people. And the corollary of that is that ecumenism then must be central, as it was in Vatican II. It's a major document in Vatican II, Ad Unum Sint, which gets very little recognition. And it can only be that way, because really the real division as Christians is, do we believe in God's love, and do we believe in a life of finding God's love and serving God's love? Or do we believe that there's no such entity as God, or no such reality as God, and that everything is about personal striving, personal ambition, personal satisfaction, personal autonomy, the greatest level of choice? That's the divide. And the way that divide is healed is not by us proselytizing or coming up with grand plans. The divide is broken down by us being loving to each other, which starts by us knowing that we're loved. So I'd like to tell you that at breakfast in the morning, like, I'm hitting her with a Pope Benedict statement and she's fighting back with a Rowan Williams statement. But it doesn't happen because, of course, Pope Benedict and Rowan Williams were wonderful friends, two of the greatest theologians of the last 50 years. That's the truth of the position.
Nonetheless, I have discovered that breakfast in your house can be very exciting all the same. We're going to have to bring this conversation to a close. We said we'd keep these to about 30 minutes. None of the time we could have could be enough to exhaust or even bring us very far down those questions. But we hope that those who have joined us this evening have found it enriching and stimulating. Again, it's been very humbling for me to even be able to share this with other people, because it's been just so enriching again to hear from both of you. Particularly, I think your wisdom and your witness, they're the two things that come home to me once again listening to you this evening. So thank you for that. Could I ask you have a special prayer from the Integritas Centre there that maybe you'd like to conclude with? And if people are interested in Integritas, they can find you on the website. Isn't that right? You have a web page as well if they want to find out more information about the home there. They can look that up. Maybe just lead us in a concluding prayer just to draw our evening together.
Yes, and just to say before the prayer, so the website is www.integritas.ie. That's INTEGRITAS.ie. Always good to get the business done before prayer. And then before, just to say to you about this prayer, so when we actually got married in 1998, there was a major issue about receiving Eucharist in the Catholic Church and in the Anglican Church. And what we decided to do for our wedding was we decided to write a prayer, an ecumenical prayer to kind of express the traditions we come from. And we've always used this prayer. Then we've prayed at our home every Thursday night when the pandemic doesn't interfere. And this is a prayer we use, which we wrote when we got married, and we've used it ever since. May we enable each other to trust entirely in the provident love of God. May we form family, community, and a deeper identity in the gentle attraction of Jesus Christ. May we support one another in responding to the unique call of the Spirit and serve as one in realizing the dream of the Spirit for all, so that in this covenant may we remain in Christ, and with Christ in each of us, may we come to be at one.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you both very, very much. And thank you to those of you who have joined us this evening. This time next week, a group of young people, young adults, whom I know through my work in college, through retreat work, will be joining us for a similar kind of conversation, exploring what it is like to live Christian faith today. So thank you very much. Thank you, Martin, for facilitating the technology, and good evening to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.